So I'm Jessie. I am currently a writer for LinkedIn. Have been at Wired, Fortune, and Back Channel, and Time, and Business Week now covering technology. And we have a panel. We're going to explore trends in visual investing today. And I'm here with Hadley, with Dr. Laura Smoliar, and with Zavian. And I'm going to ask each of you to begin by telling us how you came to investing and where your interests lie right now. And Zav, I'm going to begin with you.
I came relatively early in my career. I was, I think, 24. Had just learned about this interesting thing called cryptocurrencies. And some friends and I were thinking about starting a Bitcoin company in 2013. I was walking in and around San Francisco, talking to a bunch of my friends who happened to be venture investors that prior started a venture-backed company, and was pitching a number of them. And all of them kind of looked at me and said, look, we don't really understand this crypto thing. We understand the price is going up, but beyond that, it's kind of like very much so out there. One of the venture
2013.
firms 2013. One of the firms I was talking to was a firm, Innovation Endeavors, which at that point was essentially Eric Schmidt's Play Money. And they kind of looked at me and said, look, we don't really understand this, but it looks like you understand where we want to be investing, which is this kind of amorphous intersection union of software and deep tech. Rather than starting this company, how about you join us? And at least for me personally, VC had always been the bad guy. There's like the evil side of the table, the people who took your equity, maybe gave you a little bit of money, but didn't really understand the business. And so I kind of entered it very cautiously. About a year in, I realized that I loved it, and it allowed me access to all sorts of interesting kind of ideas, people. I still have a lot of the same, I would say, internal dissonance that Nabil pointed out earlier about, like, are you a builder? Are you an investor? Can you be both? How do you manage that? How do you balance that?
Sure.
But about 2 years in, I joined Lux, and I've been there since, and it's home and it's family.
And do you ever have a moment of cryptocurrency 2013 regret?
To the extent that any company then that was started that still happens to be alive today has been, I think, financially successful. And I think that's really just ridden the wave of the asset valuations. Sure, but it would have been a little bit of a Pyrrhic victory. A lot of those companies, I think, the best thing you could have done would have been to invest directly in Bitcoin and Ethereum then.
Sure. So Laura, you have been in tech for a long time and done a lot of things now. How did you come to your current investing?
Yeah, so I spent most of my career as an entrepreneur myself, and then I went to the dark side more recently. But
you guys keep calling it the dark side. We got to rebrand it.
Yeah. But our fund has an unusual origin. We were asked by the dean of the College of Chemistry at Berkeley to figure out how to do a fund not only to be able to bring technology out of Berkeley more efficiently, but also to bring some financial return back to the school. And so I found it to be a really interesting intellectual challenge. It revolves around understanding a lot of tax law and conflict of interest rules. And we came up with a hybrid structure where we have a for-profit fund and a sister philanthropic fund, and it's working. It's a little complicated. But anyway, at the end of the day, the idea is that there is some financial benefit back. And so we have very close relationship with Berkeley and also UCSF, where the professors really step up and help us. And we also get a very early view on technology. And I like being an early stage investor, so it's perfect for me.
Awesome. And Hadley?
Sure. I've always been interested in technology my whole life. When I was a kid, I loved math and science, and I was really, really bad at anything involving words. Probably set a record on the GMAT for the disparity between your two scores. So my father said, you should really become an engineer. So went to school for engineering, actually met my now 3 partners as engineering students. This was way back in the late 90s, before that corner was alive. And worked as a developer for a few years, managing engineering teams, and did some big company time and really hated it. And was really fortunate to link up with a couple of guys at MIT that were developing a new form of voice recognition, and kind of worked with them on the side and just helping them out. And eventually joined forces and was able to do that. And again, at another startup, so got to live through 2 venture-backed startups. Both were acquired, and just learned a ton during that time. And then wanted to leverage that experience. And I realized that I wanted to do venture for a couple reasons. And these 3 friends of mine from undergrad were all had similar kind of had been serial entrepreneurs. And instead of joining a firm, we thought, why don't we start one? So we started one with a tiny fund and started investing in 2010. Have grown that over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like I remember when you started, and now how large are you?
Our fourth fund's $100 million. Our first fund was $1.6 million. So ratio-wise, it's a lot of growth.
Yeah, I would say. So we're talking about visual technology, and I've been part of this conversation at this conference now for 4 years running. And 4 years ago, that conversation was a relatively narrow conversation. And today, it seems like visual technology touches on almost every industry that you can imagine. And so for each of you, I would love you to choose one industry that you're particularly interested in investing in, and talk about maybe either a company or a trend that you see that you have a lot of enthusiasm for, perhaps have invested in. Anybody can start.
I'll kick it off. Healthcare, I think, for me, in biology and chemistry are it's a really compelling and interesting area to be using visual technology. Not only because of all of the obvious advancements in computer vision, machine learning, AI, which I think all of the rest of the audience covered ad nauseum, but simply because of the complexity and the high rates of human failure without machine learning and without computer vision in biology and in chemistry. So I think about applying computer vision not only to automate tasks that we're already doing today, which is fine and great and dandy, but to enable humans to be able to do things that we weren't able to do before. One of, I think, the most compelling companies that we have in our portfolio in the computer vision space is a company, Recursion Pharmaceuticals. They're based in Salt Lake City. And all they do, it's such a simple concept, but it's so efficacious and so powerful. They have human cell lines, so normal, healthy human cells. They perturb them in a way to manifest various human diseases. And across tens of thousands of these perturbations, they use deep neural nets, computer vision, to assess phenotypically how the shape of the cells change based on the diseases that manifest in them. And if they can create these models, they can start screening in thousands and thousands various small molecules or biologics, various therapeutic agents against these perturbed human cell lines and characterize mathematically, not just visually, which ones are returning the human cell lines to a normal shape. And you can say, why can't humans do this? And it turns out that actually a vast majority of the drugs over the last 4 decades have been discovered rather serendipitously, like via a pathologist looking at a human cell and saying, oh, that looks interesting. Like that happened and we didn't expect it to happen. Let's double click in. But a lot of these perturbations are so kind of multifactorial. They're so small. You really need to be able to see within a single cell tens of thousands of features and across tens of thousands of cells at a time to actually remove the kind of biological noise to be able to actually do this with a high degree of accuracy. And that's one of, I think, many examples of where kind of computer vision can be applied into biology or chemistry, but it's one that we see today working in spades and one that we think can have a very large impact.
So that's a great example of a company in healthcare. It's fine if either of you want to choose the same industry, but Hadley, you want to give us another?
Yeah, I was going to say healthcare, but why don't I do something different? I think logistics and transportation is a space we've made a lot of investments over the last 4 or 5 years, and I think in all cases are using CV. It's obviously a very important input to these systems. We've tended to kind of, especially because of the maturity of a lot of kind of the autonomous car companies, try to focus on other areas. So we actually have an autonomous boat company with Evan, aviation, and then autonomous trucking more for the yard scenario. and then also unannounced an autonomous forklift company. So we joke that a pallet could actually get from a warehouse in China to here, kind of only using our portfolio if they do their job right. But
they go to the fork to the truck to the boat to the truck to the fork.
That's right, and maybe a plane, depending on how quick you need it. So yeah, I think there's kind of anything that moves. If you think about kind of automation, there's been a lot of movement in kind of pure software automation, but within the physical world, there's a ton of opportunity, and robotics and that kind of blend between robotics and some of the kind of more transportation-oriented stuff is actually still very early. And I think if you look over the next 10 years, there's still a lot of innovation to come in terms of truly automating a lot of these processes of getting goods or people from one place to another.
So Hadley, take one of those companies and tell us a little bit more about it. For example, let's take the boat.
Sure. So it's a company called C Machines. We actually looked at a bunch of companies in this space, and we really liked this team because it was a really strong combination of both kind of computer vision and technology machine learning, but also the CEO had deep expertise in his domain, whereas some of the other ones were approaching it from a pure technology point of view. And basically they can automate both long steamships that are going long distances. It's very helpful around things like gas usage, but also potentially being able to put stuff right up on the dock where now you need people to see where they're going, but also worker boats that are doing surveillance, understanding the bottom of seabeds, also patrol boats. So they're up in Boston, still relatively early, but have some nice early customers.
Awesome. How about Laura?
I'll choose healthcare, I guess. We have actually two investments that touch this space. One of them is called Invenio, and they're using a new kind of laser-based imaging technique to look at brain tissue that doesn't have to be fixed and stained. So real time in the OR when the surgeon is working, and in brain surgery, finding the margins between tumor and healthy tissue is really critical because you don't want to be cutting too much tissue, and you also don't want to be cutting too little. And so they enable that, and now adding AI to those images. It's fascinating that you could see things to a level that we can't see with our eyes, really. And so I'm very excited about the future for them.
And that's Invenio?
That's Invenio.
And you mentioned that you had two investments. Can I ask you about the other?
The other one is called Euler, and they're kind of stealthy, but they're in the LiDAR space, and it's really to be adaptive LiDAR. So not just sort of reading out, but adapting to all kinds of weather conditions and feeding that data back in and into the AI for that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So
all three of you really felt like leaning hard into healthcare. You gave us a third for variety, but I knew you were interested in healthcare. So what is it about healthcare right now, both in terms of the technology, but also the types of entrepreneurs who are presenting themselves and the readiness of the companies that that makes a difference?
Again, to go back to Nabil's conversation earlier, I think he had a point where you make these investments early, and oftentimes the rest of the community, both the venture ecosystem, the domain that you're investing into, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, will kind of look at you and say, "Are you crazy? What are you thinking?" And I remember actually our first investment in kind of healthcare or biotech, biopharma was a company out in Oakland, Zymergen. And this was 2013, 2014. They were using automation, robotics, computer vision, ML to kind of, evolve microbes to produce various kind of bioproducts. Think next-gen Kevlar or next-gen lysine or what have you. And one of the things we realized really early was that we were coming to a moment in time where, we had, I think, hit almost fundamentally the limits epistemologically of what humans can grok. Like the underlying complexity of the biology, the chemistry, the material science in these domains are just so much so that it doesn't. All you need to do is look at the success rate of industry and realize we fail way more often than we succeed. Our abstractions, our knowledge is just not there, and maybe it's a fool's errand to think that we ever will get there. So we need to figure out another way. The other bits that were coming online or that were immediately obvious was the confluence of technologies. And it wasn't just the sexy kind of deep neural nets, computer vision, whatever. It was, pretty basic data science. It was distributed compute. It was Hadoop maturing. And it was the implementation and I think the acceptance of automation in the wet lab to actually create reproducible data sets. The last bit, and this I think holds true very much so in healthcare, is you have a very large industry with a heavy head of key players, the Mercks, the Pfizers, the Takedas, the J&Js, who have been historically very slow to adopt new technology. And that's because so much of their businesses are based on actually taking drugs through clinical development and then marketing them. They've historically bought in anyone who could be a disruptor. And so that gave us a huge kind of gap, a window in time to actually create these like very meaningful, very large, very robust, very defensible businesses, such that, they get to a point where either they're going to come in and be the next Genentech, or Genentech will have to go and acquire them for, a large amount of money.
It's probably also worth adding their largest industry, and there's kind of structural changes that are happening that are allowing for a lot of this stuff. You have large data sets that have been very much siloed, and there's a bunch of companies working on de-siloing them. There's no other industry I know of that has a situation where even within the same system, they're not able to connect the data, even if the two parties wanted to, and that's slowly starting to change. And then you have the incentive structure of the way that they work in terms of how payers and providers are incentivized, and that's slowly changing to a place where they're hopefully starting to align more with the general health of the individual. And then finally, you have individuals taking more ownership and interest in their own health care. So this kind of consumerization and that kind of confluence, while it's super slow, but it's going to come together to provide a really interesting opportunity for entrepreneurs.
So do you have anything to add before we jump in? Then maybe I'll start this next round with you, if you don't mind, Laura. If we were having this conversation 4 years ago, we were talking about trends in visual technology, the conversation would have started with a number of consumer devices. We were talking about Oculus, we were talking about augmented reality, Magic Leap. It makes me wonder, are those types of technologies interesting at all to you right now? You don't have to start, Laura.
I guess I think those technologies have developed components and pieces that are interesting for use elsewhere, but I do find the healthcare applications more compelling. And especially as healthcare gets more distributed, I think it opens things up. In the case of Invenio, neuropathologists are far and few between. If you live in a rural place, you're not going to see one, but now They can get your data, right, and see. So I think, I think it's just more compelling, and it's solving the healthcare issues.
Sure.
I would say I'm not. Maybe I'm missing something on Magic Leap and Oculus. I'm not sure exactly to what extent they're incorporating strong kind of computer vision components, but I will say that over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've certainly seen the adoption of computer vision in consumer electronics and consumer products. And all I need to do is pull out my iPhone and have it recognize my face. We're invested in a number of smart home devices that kind of recognize who you are, where you are. The one bit that I like thinking about, and it's a little bit more of a philosophical quagmire, is kind of thinking about how and where we draw the ethical kind of borders on these things. And again, San Francisco, I don't know who all kind of saw this. I think San Francisco 2 or 3 weeks ago announced they're going to ban the use of kind of at least publicly governed facial recognition. In China right now, we have a Muslim minority population, the Uyghurs, who are very heavily watched over with computer vision tech. And so these are technologies that end up governing populaces and controlling us in a lot of ways, and being careful about it, but also pushing for, I think, ways where it can actually make our lives better. Unfortunately, from a venture perspective, I think the ways that it's made our lives better, the kind of iPhone example, they've come into products and companies with known distribution or with existing distribution, and they've become futurized, right? They haven't yet, I don't know if we've seen really strong consumer level companies that relied solely on computer vision.
Sure, that makes sense. So let's return to healthcare then for a second. Laura, what would you like to see happen for some of these companies to be able to grow? If I give you a magic wish.
Well, it's an interesting thing as we make progress on the technologies. I think one of the hardest things is the adoption side. So earlier, there was a question on one of the panels about how will education change for medical doctors and computer scientists if they're going to work in this field, right? And I find it interesting, the Invenio images get artificially colored so that the colors look like what a radiologist is used to seeing. It's not real, right? But in order to have it adopted, you have to fit into that old paradigm. So you might ask, well, what happens when you have more data, more kinds of data layered into an image? How are you going to show that in a way that a radiologist can understand it, right? So I think there's going to have to be movement on both sides.
That sounds like a design question.
Yeah,
to some degree.
And education, I think.
Sure. So what would you like to see happen in the field for some of these businesses in healthcare or otherwise to take off?
Well, with healthcare, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening within the hospital, even within the hospital room, but also kind of the radiology type use case. I'm excited for, and this is going to take a little time for some of these things to come into the home, where we have kind of constant monitoring of self and the kind of line between what happens in kind of the doctor's office and what happens in the home starts to blur. And I think from a technology perspective, we're starting to get close where I think you could have a lot of really interesting use cases. Unfortunately, more of the incentive structure is not really built for a situation where some of them even being pretty expensive, but having a really big value to the end patient can't be paid for.
What do you mean? Give me an example.
Different things that could kind of look at you on a daily basis in terms of kind of body weight, or especially the geriatric people older, that it could be monitored in terms of breathing patterns and stuff. From a technology perspective, that is generally ready and working at a good degree right now, but we don't have incentive structures where the folks that pay for it, like Medicare and like their private insurance, are ready to start paying, even though the benefit to them should be a positive ROI.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned ethics as this sort of landscape when we're thinking about visual technology that we need to be exploring more thoughtfully. Do you think that investors have a role in doing that as you're making at the very beginning of the funnel, as you're making your investment decisions in companies?
I would say 100%. And it's... I don't know why we would, in any capacity, remove the capital from the moral implications of the product or the technology. I mean, it doesn't take far to realize that, IBM funded data centers for the Nazis, U.S. capital markets funded, and this is dark, like Monsanto during Agent Orange, right? Our taxpayer dollars funded, a lot of the kind of the nuclear development. And it's not to say that those were bad decisions, right? It's just to say that our capital ultimately affects real life, and we should just be well aware of that.
You were nodding your head, Laura.
Oh, I agree completely. I know investors who chose not to invest in YouTube early on because of all the porn. I mean, that's a real decision, right?
Go ahead, Hadley.
I was going to say, Steve Jobs had this interesting quote talking about technology as a bicycle for the mind, and basically that it's here to enable us and allow us to do things better. And I think if more investors and entrepreneurs kind of thought about it in that point of view versus kind of a pure monetary viewpoint, then a lot of the issues that we're running into now could be avoided.
Well, it seems to me, as someone who's watched the industry and covered the industry for years, that conversation around ethics ebbs and flows. It rises up some years and then it sort of recedes into the background some years. And right now, because of what is going on more broadly in the tech industry, it is front and center. It is impossible to have a conversation without talking about ethics. I'm curious, in particular, Laura, you've been an entrepreneur for a very long time. Do you feel like the conversation ebbs and flows, or do you feel like from where you sit within a university among entrepreneurs, it's fairly consistent?
I think it moves between different fields, but I don't think it goes away completely. It's just, one day it's YouTube, and next day it's CRISPR babies, and it just moves around into different fields.
Sure. Okay, so ethics is is sort of a field that we need to consider the companies and the investments we're making in visual technology through. What are the other considerations that you need to think about outside of whether a company is going to make money when you are investing in the company?
And this might be a little bit of a false answer, but if it fits like the ethical guidelines and it's going to make money, that sounds like an awesome investment. So sign me up, send it over.
Silence on this.
Yeah, where do I wire money?
Fair enough. Okay, so we've covered healthcare. Give us another industry. We've covered a little bit transportation. Another industry you think is going to be hugely impacted by visual technology in the next 10 years?
Well, I think agriculture. I mean, somebody was talking about Planet Labs earlier. I mean, when I saw Planet Labs early on, they were looking at a lot of agricultural data. And I think nobody had really had access to that in the same way before. So I think there'll be a lot in that field.
Have you seen anything? Yeah.
We have a company I'm excited about called Eniac, which is a indoor, fully autonomous farm where robots are able to do kind of the entire growing, watering, picking process. And this has interesting implications for kind of being able to have food close to population sources. Since no humans enter the room, you don't need pesticides, and you actually don't even need to clean it. So just one area that we've been excited about.
Cool. Anything you want to throw in?
Candidly, it's anywhere. I think we're going to expect our computers, wherever they are, whatever they look like, whether it's edge IoT or laptops or iPhones, to have perception, right? And that perception is not just going to be computer vision; it's going to be an ability to kind of sit in the background and listen and know what you're talking about and help you. So whether it's in agriculture, and I love the two examples that you guys just brought up. I'm invested in a company, Clarify, or Lux is invested in a company, Clarify, that's in New York, local. I know Matt Zeller has spoken in the past. I don't actually know if he's speaking this year or not. But one of the beautiful things that Clarify does is it develops and it's kind of unleashed this incredibly easy to use API, SDK, and level and series of models that anyone can use. And so we look at our customers at Clarify, and it's literally anywhere from agriculture to healthcare to autonomous to transportation to military to retail and e-com, right? And we see kind of like the early signals of pull from many different kind of markets. One of the most, I think, interesting examples that I remind Matt and Clarify, but then also my partners at Lux about is, hey, look, if we were at Twilio, the texting API in 2010 or 2009, and we saw all of these kind of interesting use cases and then people developing apps, would we have had any clue that in 2016 the number one kind of main market for Twilio would be cabs, right? Texting you, hey, your Uber's on its way, hey, your Lyft is outside. Would we have been able to predict that? No, right? And so these technologies, I think they're going to be so pervasive and kind of fundamentally just present in all of our technology and all of the actual instantiations of computers. It's as an investor, I try to remind myself just to keep an open, keen, and nimble mind to not kind of lock myself into any particular domain.
Sounds good. I want to make time for a couple of questions, and then I have a couple of last questions. Anybody out there want to kick us off? We got one back here, maybe ninth row in the middle.
Hi, Frank Gehry. I'm an AI researcher. I've done some things previously in the healthcare space and found for someone who wasn't in that space before, going to HIMSS and things like that was very much an eye-opening situation around regulation. And it was just really hard for a company that was used to or a person who was used to doing web-related things to just deal with all those regulations. Do you have any recommendation or have things changed a bit in the last few years that make that easier? Like, how can someone who doesn't have a medical person on their team get involved in this space?
Another one in the back? give folks a
I get really excited about intersectional teams, and so what that means is having a team, particularly when they come into complex or regulatory kind of heavily kind of wielded domains, where we have both kind of the technical expert who may not understand the nuances of the domain, but then also someone who spent time in the domain or at least comes from that background. That's not necessary. I think as a technologist, and again, this is one of those things where I keep on mentioning Nabil's talk because I actually thought it was really interesting and pertinent to a lot of these topics. But as a CEO or as a founding team, it's your job not just to develop the technology and the product, but it's to understand the landscape and have empathy for sympathizing or understanding why things are the way they are and working both within them, but realizing how can you slowly evolve them over time. Right.
I think the other thing is probably the people making the regulations need to hear from people like you. They're learning. The FDA is moving on this, right? And they need input. So I think getting involved in those discussions will give you more insight into what their thinking is. But also it's probably good for them to hear from you about, the realities coming from the technology side. Yeah.
Do you have another question? Over here.
Hi, how are you? I'm Michael Murphy. I'm one of the co-founders of a New York-based startup called Radar. I was interested to know what the panel thinks about the main limitations for CV systems today, as well as how those limitations differ across healthcare, transportation, logistics, et cetera.
Just a little question there.
From a technical standpoint, or from
Preferably.
Well, I'll speak to
really
this.
big on multi-layered.
Yeah. So many moons ago, when I was doing X-ray microscopy, the limitations were actually in the CCD technologies, the cameras, and how fast you could dump the data off into the computer. And I think that has progressed so much. It's really amazing. But probably it's still a fundamental, rate limiting step, right? It's just how quickly can you acquire, how many bits of data do you have in those detectors, and how quickly can you dump that data and process it.
The best example I have is I really do fundamentally believe that computer vision is at a point today where, by large, it's better than human vision, right? And it's the ability of computers to see across a scale and within every piece of datum to actually see a higher fidelity or hold a higher number of kind of factors in the computer's brain. So I don't really think computer vision, for most cases, is the limiting factor. Pointing to transportation, I think there's a reason. Like, we can drive with our eyes, right? Computers or autonomous cars, for the most part, unless you're Tesla, need LiDARs and radars and all these other kind of devices. I think that's largely based on our ability to have common sense, which is another type of AI, right? If a computer vision car sees a bumper sticker of a stop sign, if the car in front of it, right, it might stop, right? It doesn't know that that's a bumper sticker, but I realize as a driver, wait, that's a bumper sticker on a car. And so it's all these kind of adjacent, not pure computer vision per se, but other ways of machine intelligence that we haven't yet figured out how to encode into computers.
Anything?
I guess bandwidth tends to be a surprising answer to this.
I guess so. One last question, right down here. Sorry. Okay, we're gonna make two last questions. Who has the mic over there, guys? Okay.
Hi, I'm an AI researcher, Vision, and in the field of advertising. I love hearing about all the fantastic work being done in health, which I really appreciate. But what have you folks seen happening within the world of advertising and using computer vision to understand what's happening, to produce better ads, come up with new ways of understanding what really causes us to react in a positive or negative way to imagery?
Advertising. Any of the three of you looking closely at advertising? All right.
There's there's a lot of work, I think, from a number of academic universities and then a number of small companies doing kind of like emotion recognition,
Yeah.
right? And so that's that's realizing your posture, your emotions, your happiness, your sadness. If you're at a bar, do you want another drink? Do I like those shoes? Should I, whatever? Like it's a pretty kind of creative and out there bit. Ad tech, the ability to layer in perception into ad tech is hard because ad tech historically, I think, has been premised mainly on pushing technologies to us, not taking signals from the real world and then pushing back. So the feedback, like once we figure out that feedback cycle, I think we'll be better at incorporating the various modalities of ML or AI or whatever you want to call it into it. But the bigger question right now is what's the actual feedback loop?
Well put. And on that note, I want to thank our panel. You guys, all of you are doing really interesting things, but have really kind of leaned towards pay attention to healthcare. So that'll be our headline. Thanks a lot.
Very much. Great job. Thank you, Jesse.